And welcome back, everyone, to another edition of Going for Two, presented by our dear friends at Home Field Apparel. I am your host, the publisher of the Extra Points newsletter, Matt Brown. I'm joined here by my colleague in the D1 Ticker Extended Universe, Bryan Fischer. We are pretty close to the halfway point of the college football season. Bryan, how you holding up?
Well, holding up is an operative word, but I'm excited. This is kind of one of the best times of the year if you're a sports fan, in my opinion. I guess you could say. I know people like March and everything that's going on with March Madness, but you got college football. You have the NFL, of course. You have baseball playoffs. We have the basketball coming back. We have the NHL just started. Like this is a kind of a sports fan's paradise with kind of the major sports all going on at once. And I, for one, cannot wait. We got Champions League soccer. We got Premier League. We got all the 5 leagues in Europe. Some thrilling title races. So like this is a pretty fun time if you're a sports fan.
It is. I am somebody that I think we're getting to the point now where I'm going to probably watch I've watched one baseball game so far this year. I had kind of, I'm going to admit, in like late April, I just figured, Cleveland's ownership doesn't care about winning, so why should I be emotionally invested in them? And then it turns out that the White Sox and the Twins suck, and the Guardians are in the playoffs now. And like, well, the least I can do.
I mean, should we? You can tell what my hat I'm wearing if you're watching on YouTube. So should we put down some sort of miniature?
No, I absolutely not, because your team has the guy that hits all the home runs, and my team doesn't have anybody that hits any home runs.
Yeah, but my team has no bullpen, so I don't know if you've been seeing what's been going on with the back end of the Yankees rotation.
I want to say
not good.
Infected tattoo was a headline and part of that. I know that's why everyone listens to the show. It's like Matt discovers baseball for the first time since like 2006. But okay, not great. I don't retain very much of my love for baseball. That was my original favorite sport, but the reflexive anti-Yankees.
There's a lot of that.
It's still very much there. No, so like this is also the time of year, just on the college side, where we kind of take stock about what's already happened, what sort of things we thought were going to happen aren't happening, and try to plan out the rest of our year. We are at Extra Points. We're unfortunately not a place that's going to send me somewhere on site every week. Part of that is because, like Bryan, we do travel for non-football things. There's different conferences we're going to. I'm going to be in Charlotte in a couple of weeks for some on-site stuff there that's not directly related to 49er football. But we were trying to figure out, okay, I've covered games before. Like that was part of my career before Extra Points. Where should we go next? I don't mind sharing this. I don't think this will get me into trouble. Our original plan was to go to Hawaii. And because I think a lot of things with Hawaii didn't work out maybe the way that the program planned, maybe now isn't the best time to go spend a week on the islands, which I'm broken up about because I wanted to go to Hawaii. And not just because I wanted to go to Hawaii, but I'm really curious about UH. But I understand maybe now's not the best time. So we're looking at what are some other places to go. And I'm pretty excited. I just bought my tickets today. I am going to the Brawl of the Wild. I'm going to go to Montana at Montana State. I am interested. If you are somebody that cares about FCS football or unique rivalries or about Montana, and there are angles that you think I should be looking into, I'm interested in it. I have a couple of things already planned, but putting that out there now, and excited to spend a good 72 plus hours in a place where I haven't been, and what should be an absolute dynamite football game.
I'm jealous for you. Like that's one of those maybe not the bucket list that people think of, but when it comes to FCS rivalry games, that is one of the best. And I think the atmosphere there should be electric. Hopefully the weather will cooperate with you, whether that's on the positive end of the scale and it's nice and clear, or on the opposite end and there's a snowstorm. But I'm a little bit jealous. I might have to see what I can do if I can see if I can maybe join you. Maybe I'll make a stop over at Bronco's place there in Montana as well, for my HeadCoachU co-host. But it's exciting times. Yeah, and I'm actually going to stop by the Big Sky offices this week ahead of the USC Utah game.
Which is a great idea. That's right. Not super far from Utah. Other stuff going on there in that state. Also tentatively planning a couple of other mid-majory and maybe majory trips in December. We'll share more about that once it's all kind of solidified. There's a couple of different balls there in the air. But that's a game that's several weeks from now. And hopefully we end up in the same place. It's been a minute since we've done that. We do have a couple of things to talk about that actually did happen, or at least might happen. And it's a little bit different because the last don't know, friggin' 5 weeks of the show, the calendar's been set for us because, oh, well, somebody got fired. I guess we'll talk about that job. No FBS head coach got fired last week. So I was only off by 1 week, but a bunch of things did happen. I think we can jump into one of those here first. That's probably germane to a lot of the Extra Points readership. You might have seen late last week. This was Pete Thamel at ESPN tweeted right as we were all kind of shutting down for the week that Kennesaw State had emerged as the favorite to join Conference USA. And I think that choice of words is important. And I wrote everything that I know about this and what I've been hearing in Extra Points earlier this week. It's behind the paywall, but if you're interested in that kind of coverage, I think it's worth the $8. So I'm not going to share everything. What I can say is I did some more phone calls here. We're recording this on Tuesday afternoon. I don't actually know as of 3:44 God's time zone exactly what happened with the Georgia Board of Regents as they were discussing it today. I saw that on the itinerary. I know that as of like 2:30, nobody at Kennesaw State had told the ASUN that they were planning on leaving. Although the people at the ASUN offices have the internet, like they are aware of these kind of conversations, and that I don't know if you had heard this, Brian. I had been hearing since the summer that Kennesaw was at the top of the board. That this was a school that Conference USA was really interested in. We can talk about why there in a second, but it wasn't a done deal. And part of that was because in Georgia, everybody is governed under the same Board of Regents, the same structure, and that's a highly political board. I don't mean that like the Democrat Republican, but just like in terms of like local pettiness. What I had been hearing all summer was Kennesaw's not going to get permission to do this. And I'm assuming something changed. I don't think you would go through all of this trouble if you weren't confident otherwise. I don't know exactly why that is. So I think it is safe to say at this point, we are certainly trending towards that direction of Kennesaw State becoming the 10th team to join Conference USA, whether that's in 2023 or 2024. But what happens beyond that? Not nearly as clear.
Yeah, I think that is one to keep an eye out. I feel like we better call up our old buddy Stephen Gottfried to chat just Kennesaw State athletics because he knows that place quite well. But I think it's interesting just in terms of the footprint of Conference USA and getting into Georgia and making that a priority area. I think for the league, that's something that they kind of abandoned given some of their departures. It's weird to kind of look back at the history of Conference USA, and I mean this is a league founded in 1995, and to see all the former members and not only just the current and future schools that are coming in, like just the list of teams that have had a touch point with Conference USA is kind of incredible when you look back at it, right?
Yeah. I made that joke on Twitter. I didn't say this to be mean. I was like, okay, here's like the membership timeline, and here's the membership timeline of like Tower of Power, which has been playing for like 50 years, and they change instrumentation every 18 months. I think, I'm guessing about a fifth of all of the G5, if not, no, like a third of all the G5 has spent time there at least once. To be in Georgia now makes a lot of sense, right? Like there's a couple of reasons why Kennesaw in particular is attractive to, one of these kind of leagues, right? One of those is that unlike most FCS schools, Kennesaw is huge. It's got 40,000 students. It's the second biggest school in the state of Georgia, and it grew from the third largest. It's in the outskirts of suburban Atlanta. I think it's fair to say it's in that general area ish. Within an hour to downtown.
Northwest,
yeah, right. You fly into that airport, and the schools with that kind of enrollment and that kind of growth trajectory and graduate offerings tend to look more like FBS institutions. Also, unlike a lot of other FCS schools, Kennesaw State's been pretty good at football. This year is, I think, their worst season basically since starting, but they've been above 500 every other year. They've won 3 conference titles. They made the playoffs 4 times. They've won a game in the playoffs every single time. And we've seen when you add a team with a culture of winning from FCS to FBS, whether that's a James Madison, who's undefeated right now, whether that's an App State, that transition tends to be a little bit easier than somebody like, say, Old Dominion or Charlotte that didn't have much of an FCS history moving up and then building things from scratch. Add all that to the fact that, to the extent that there is a geographic middle in Conference USA, which there isn't really, like Georgia would be an important place to be. It's an important place to be for recruiting. It's an important place to be for talent acquisition and a bunch of other different places. And I think as you go to market for a new media rights deal, not to say they're going to go, do what they did before, just go add a bunch of metro areas with schools that don't have any penetration, but being able to say that you have some kind of presence, there's my dog, some kind of presence there in Atlanta or in Georgia would be pretty beneficial. So that's why this move makes sense. I understand why some Conference USA fans are a little bit concerned about adding a 10th school in general. Everyone's going to have a ramping up period to get to FBS. And to the extent that Conference USA has an identity right now, like no disrespect to Middle Tennessee, putting Miami in a garbage can, I think given the current lineup of schools, it's a basketball conference. And Kennesaw State's terrible at basketball. Like there's bad, and then there's like never won 17 games in a regular season kind of bad, sub 250 Ken Palm kind of bad. So, having to play New Mexico State and Liberty and Western Kentucky all the time will be a challenge for them. But the upside is there in a way that I don't think is immediately apparent in almost any other FCS school that could potentially move up right now from a football perspective.
And I think adding it too, just kind of leaning into the geography a little bit. I mean, you're talking about probably 3 hours to Middle Tennessee. You got probably 90 minutes or so to Jacksonville State, which is joining the league too. So, there are some regional ties. I think that it does make sense from that standpoint. And you mentioned just the size of the university. I think that is the key standpoint. Is when you're talking about some of these Conference USA schools, they are kind of smaller regional institutions, and to add a big time program like that in a metro area like Atlanta, I think is going to be huge for the league, as you mentioned, from a recruiting standpoint, from being able to sell that to a lot of players' families. Especially given the transfer portal era with guys coming from the Power Five, maybe more down into the Group of Five level. I think that could make a school like Kennesaw State a little bit more amenable to receiving some of those transfers. But it's still going to take a lot of work, and I think the important thing to keep in mind is, in addition to all this move, as we keep saying, there is still that kind of a specter of there's going to be some changes to Division One, and Kennesaw State likely going to have to not only invest to get into Conference USA, but invest it to some of those areas like basketball to make sure that they are fully ready to go to kind of the maximum of D1. So I think it's going to be an interesting move, because I think you look at it maybe in 5 or 10 years time, this could look like a very smart move for Conference USA, just given the institution and where that institution ultimately wants to go. Like this is not a school that I don't think is just going to sit on their hands and kind of rest on their laurels a little bit. They have some ambition here, and I think you can say that for a lot of schools in kind of that Georgia system. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that kind of shakes out, especially considering that they're not the only ones that might be under consideration for Conference USA.
That's true. So I wrote about a couple of the other institutions that have had conversations with CUSA that have been in that world in the story earlier this week. If that's something that you're interested in, you do bring up an important point, and this is something that everyone has to think about here for schools that are maybe thinking of going from Division II to Division I or FCS to FBS. We should get some semblance of clarity, some very beginning first drafts of membership criteria in the coming weeks. I was talking to somebody today who was expecting it within 2, might be more into November, but like not 6 months away to get this information. I know just off the top of my head, one thing that I know Kennesaw is going to have to spend some money on is their stadium, which seats under 9,000 people. And it's a nice stadium. It's new. I know the Atlanta United 2 the plays there, and it's a multi-purpose facility. I was talking to some folks that were familiar with it when it was first constructed, and they're like, you can add a double decker, you can add some temporary bleachers and make this a 20,000, 25,000 seat facility. You can't really go a ton bigger than that. And it's probably too new to junk completely. Like if you had to go play downtown for a year, you could. You can ask Georgia State what it's like playing in Mercedes-Benz or in the Georgia Dome when you're bringing 9,000 people to the stadium. It's not a great environment, but like there are options there. But anybody's doing this, whether you're a Division II school in upstate New York or Connecticut or New Jersey, or you're Eastern Kentucky or your McNeese State or your anybody else, it's not cheap. And it's, you're looking at not just the down payment for the reclassification and maybe adjusting your sports sponsorship, but a lot of other operational money. So anyone thinking about doing that, I hope you know someone who can kind of check. because it's not something that you can do at Aldi anymore. Like it's grown up money.
Well, I know we kind of joke about consultants and whatnot, but there's a reason that market exists for these schools to go to them, because sometimes there's like, it's not only a Byzantine process to kind of work through in terms of some of the NCAA paperwork and all that, but like actually figuring out, we need 4 additional trainers, when we add three different sports, we got to worry about Title IX implications. I think that's something that gets overlooked quite a bit in terms of schools moving up and moving down. Sometimes because of sports sponsorship requirements, it's not just adding one sport. You might have to add 2, and what the associated costs are with that. So there's a whole lot going on, and I do find it fascinating, just given the inflection point we are at with the NCAA. The other thing to keep in mind too is with the college football playoff and the potential additional revenues that are coming through there, there's probably a little bit more money going to conferences like Conference USA and the Sun Belt and whatnot. So there will be some trickle down in terms of the actual revenues of the college football playoff expansion trickling down to schools that could take advantage of it, like Kennesaw State. Not saying it's going to be a whole lot, but when you're talking about maybe it's another $200K in the budget coming down from the college football playoff by the time it all filters out. That could be significant when you're talking about not only assistant coaches' salaries, but paying full-time trainers, mental health for student athletes and stuff like that. So there's a whole lot of additional things to consider as we kind of hit this very, very interesting moment in college athletics.
I mean, $200K is salary, benefits, 401k matching for 3, maybe 4 backhand staffers. To say nothing of whether that would go to coaching or anything. And that's the kind of stuff that's going to be important. Plus, you move up to FBS, your paycheck game allowance will double, right? If you're making $700,000 as an FCS team to play in SoCon Saturday, you can make $1.5 million, $1.6 million, $1.7 million, depending on who you book, to play that second Saturday in September kind of situation.
And I think on that point in particular, we've seen some of the MAC schools recently, especially some of the new athletic directors that have taken over the MAC schools, have said they really don't want to play as many of those paycheck games. And so, there's openings there, especially, you're talking about some of the SEC opponents that you would likely play if you're Kennesaw State. Those are big checks, and they can help certainly fund your athletic athletic program, I think, moving forward. And it is going to be interesting to see how that market too adjusts from the probably changes, I think, overall, just in terms of scheduling philosophy that will come with a 12-team college football playoff. I think you're already hearing certainly rumors about moves to more 9 conference game schedules for not just the SEC, but even potentially the ACC as well. So, that's going to have an impact on the market for these games as well. So a lot going on that front.
One place that you're not going to see a market adjustment, a place where you know exactly how much it's going to cost and what kind of goods you're going to be able to get, is with our good friends at Home Field Apparel. They make the most comfortable t-shirts, the most comfortable hoodies, the most comfortable officially licensed collegiate apparel, sporting unique vintage designs. I am wearing the old vintage UCLA shirt right here in honor of UCLA football being good and interesting. We've got the Utah
team they just
hoodie.
beat Utah.
That's right. Team they just beat. When I'm done here and when we're all recording, I will probably take a hike down to the gym and I will put on my West Virginia hoodie. I think that, like we said, several times here, a good 80% of all of my clothes that are not professional dress are home field related, including one of the nice things here now that it's like in the 40s. Sometimes you can do the full Indiana tuxedo. The Indiana tuxedo is the home field t-shirt, the home field hoodie, and the Yukon joggers as the sweatpants. The full home field, just in a big snuggly cocoon of college football Twitter hipster comfort. Big fan. Taylor, my wife, not as much. Makes fun of me for if I walk out of the house with the Indiana tux. But what can I say? You can't take the Ohio out of the guy, even if you take the guy out of Ohio.
I feel like we need to talk to Connor about branching out. Maybe we can do some sheets, some additional home field apparel lines, if you will.
Yeah.
Blankets, something like that.
A snuggie or a slanket.
Snuggie,
right? Connor, you've got my phone number. You know how to make this happen. And folks that are listening to this and want Connor's phone number, I won't give it to you, but I will make an introduction if you want to go talk about getting your stuff within the home field line, because they're dropping FCS and G5 and refreshes all of the time. They just dropped some new Marquette shirts. They had the Wyoming stuff, which was much better than I had expected, given the horrific color scheme that you have to operate under. You had the ECU stuff in recent memory too. You can get all of that at homefieldapparel.com. And when you do, use promo code Extra Points. Save 15% off that first order. That's homefieldapparel.com. There was something else completely unrelated to conference realignment that I did want to talk to you about. Normally, like I mentioned on the show, we have spent a lot of this time talking about coaching searches. Nobody in the college ranks at the FBS level got fired. I'm a degenerate, but man, I don't have 15 minutes to talk about the Wofford head coaching search. Like, if that's what you're looking for, God bless. there's find somewhere else on the internet. But there was still a big firing rather. The Carolina Panthers early in the season have told Matt Rhule that his services are no longer needed. And based on the social media chatter and the agent chatter and some of the conversations that I had and read over the past couple of days, Matt Rhule is going to be a very popular coaching candidate for many of these openings. Now, will he take one of those gigs? That remains to be seen, because as best as we can tell, Matt Rhule is going to be getting a gigantic novelty-sized monopoly bag of money. And if you have that much money, maybe you don't necessarily need to go to Arizona State. Maybe you can just like do the Coach O thing, where you just pop around and watch games for fun and BS with coaches and drink margaritas. But coaches aren't wired that way. Most coaches anyway aren't wired that way, and they often want to immediately jump back in. I think I have a contrarian. I'm workshopping here a opinion about Mr. Rhule and his candidacy and what he brings to the table. But before I kind of riff on that, I'd love to know what you think about whether you think it is likely he goes back to the college ranks, and what we should think about a candidate with his more unique profile heading into the search.
Well, I do think he is headed back to the college ranks, and you mentioned that bag that he's getting, $40 million that David Tepper still has to end up paying him out, which it makes it very amenable for a lot of these schools that are maybe paying some of these bigger buyouts. Where you can kind of cut a little corners in terms of what you're actually paying the head coach, and then rerouting some of that money towards the assistant salary pool, which is massive for any head coach in terms of taking jobs nowadays. Yep. I just think he is not the type, Matt Rhule, to kind of sit out on a beach or anything like that. Maybe he will sit out a year, but I think at the end of the day, he's one of those coaches, and he just loves kind of getting back into it on the daily grind. I do think he does like as much as he wanted to try that his hand at the NFL game. I do think he's better suited for the college game, and he just makes a lot of sense for a lot of these programs like Nebraska, Wisconsin, if it ends up coming to that in terms of the final closing kick here for Jim Leonhard. But he could be plug and play pretty much anywhere. He's kind of proven that over his career. He's had success at Temple, which, as we've seen, is a tough job to win at. Really rebuilt Baylor quicker than anybody could have imagined. And he was, Northeast guy. You got to remember, coming from Temple down there into Baylor, made it really some great connections with Texas high school coaches. Recruited well, really recruited that Big 12 championship team that Dave Aranda won. A lot of those guys were recruited down there to Waco by Matt Rhule. So talent identification, just how he runs his program. I think the atmosphere that he builds, he's very well suited to a lot of these jobs that are open right now. And I think that's a reason why you're going to hear his name kind of mentioned as candidate number one on a lot of these lists.
I want to talk about the Temple thing. I want to talk about the Baylor thing a little bit. And I want to preface everything I'm about to say here by saying, I am not saying that Matt Rhule's a bad football coach. I'm definitely not saying that. I'm not saying that he will do poorly moving back to college. So let me make sure that is stated very clearly before we get into this here. My thinking here is that I want to push back on the idea that this is a candidate that should automatically vault to the top of every board as the sweepstakes winner champion, or somebody who is like the on paper can't miss guy. And some of that has nothing to do with Matt Rhule. Some of that is, I think, I am inclined to believe we should retire that concept entirely after Scott Frost and after Dan Mullen and after almost what happened with Jim Harbaugh, or at least the beginning of that era. And there are so many things that go into whether somebody's successful or not. And it's really hard to predict, even if somebody seems to fit perfectly on paper. But I want to talk a little bit more about this resume. So one, Matt Rhule did win at Temple. And not only did he win at Temple, he won a lot at Temple. He was the first guy to get Temple into the Associated Press at any level since 1979. College Game Day went to a Temple football game. Like they were relevant. They won 10 games more than once. However,
Penn State too.
What?
Beat Penn State as well.
Beat Penn State. I remember that was the year when they sacked Christian Hackenberg rushing 2. And it was for me very funny to watch. Temple is not an easy job, but in the last 15 years, 4 different coaches have taken them to bowl games. Like, it's not a dead end place. Al Golden came in there and won 8, 9 games and got them to bowl games. Then he left for another job and did poorly. He was replaced by Steve Adazio, who then promptly won 9 games. Struggled a bit the second year, but won a bowl game, something that nobody, very few people have ever done. Went to do 2 other jobs where he was not particularly successful, and for on and off the field reasons, but showed that you could do something there. Matt Rhule comes in, struggles for 1 season, builds it up into a strong program. He leaves. He's replaced by Jeff Collins, who makes back-to-back bowl games and leaves and is not successful. He's been fired. And then Rod Carey comes in and was a little bit of a question mark hire on paper to come in, and wasn't terribly successful. And the team's not very good right now. But I look at that and think a lot of different people now have won football games at Temple, and it might be something, might be nothing, that most of them, with Rhule being the exception, have not been very successful somewhere else. Could be coincidence, just something to think about. Winning 10 games is a big deal. Winning and going to bowl games is not something that has not happened at Temple. Then he goes to Baylor, and what Baylor became in year 3 of that era, I think, is unquestionably exceptionally rare. Right? That's a huge accomplishment to come in with Baylor had like 45 scholarships when he comes in there. And walk-on caliber guys, and they were atrocious in 1 year, and then at the end they're playing in a New Year's Six bowl game. He leaves, right? Even though he leaves with an under 500 record at Baylor, everyone's going to look at that era as extremely successful. The thing that I think bugs me about this a little bit is that coming into Baylor that first year is not like any other, or unlike almost any other college football job. If you were a head coach and you were a big culture guy, rah-rah guy, player guy, which is not pejorative, but that's kind of what the bit on the book on Rhule has been a little bit. You can create cultural buy-in and mold an entity in your image a lot easier if it's at below ground zero than it is to some place where the roster tear down and the culture tear down and everything else is going to look a little bit different. And that situation is not going to be what Arizona State or Nebraska or Wisconsin or some other places are. It will be a little bit different. The one skill set that I think is pretty clear about all these 2 college jobs is he did a really good job hiring assistant coaches, which I think is a critical component of being a successful college coach. And to do that in 2 different parts of the country, great. My concern here is then he went to the NFL and was correct. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, because you probably watched more Carolina Panthers football games than I did, but they were bad. Like this was not, a couple, balls broke the wrong way. And we were 10-7 on paper, but we finished 7-9 or whatever. Like, they were pretty uncompetitive. And some of that wasn't his fault, right? You have a weird owner, you have bad roster situation, never had an above average quarterback, blah, 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 but not good. You could not see schematic mastermind. And we also saw very college football coach in the NFL to the point where he's getting involved in Twitter graphics and shit, which is the kind of thing that college coaches do. So my concern when looking at this after all of that is good football coach, been successful. College football is a really different sport than it was 4 years ago. It's where NIL wasn't really a thing. The roster turnover happens at different paces now. Recruiting happens at different paces. Your staff, like your right-hand people, some of them might stay in the NFL. One of them's leading Texas Tech right now. They're all across the country. All I'm saying is I would not look at that and think this is plug and play automatic success. And you might come back and suddenly find that the way that you ran a program is going to, you're stepping into a different situation than what you had before. I don't know if you could automatically say, because this worked at Baylor, this will work at ASU, or this will probably work. That's that. I think that's it. I would want to ask a bunch more questions if I had to make a $7 million bet on this guy.
Well, I think the concept of the home run hire, as you've alluded to, has been thrown out the door. Like we just don't know. But I think in terms of traits and a track record that you can at least bet on, this would be a horse you'd want to kind of put some money out the window on. I think with Matt Rhule in particular, you look at Carolina and they just never figured out the quarterback position. I mean, it is as simple as that. A revolving door there with starters. Obviously, Baker Mayfield was not the answer that they were hoping for this year. He's already hurt. But I think 25 straight losses when allowing 17 points or more, that is not a good look on anybody, especially in the NFL where parity is completely apparent on pretty much every game and every Sunday. So it was a struggle for him. But I think going back to the college level, you mentioned the game changing. I almost think it's easier now for guys to go from the NFL back into college football or vice versa. I saw Dan Wolken at USA Today wrote a big column about saying that this should put an end to the college football to the NFL experience. I disagree with that, and going vice versa in the case of Matt Rhule, because they're actually coming a little bit more aligned. I think nowadays when you have especially these major Power 5 schools, you're having kind of almost a player personnel department that is looking at the transfer portal. You're looking at guys through that. You're looking at kind of the model where you have your draft in terms of recruiting, and you have through the transfer portal with kind of free agency. So I think there are a lot of parallels to how you can kind of structure your staff and what is ultimately on the head coach to do it. It's especially nowadays, you have analysts for this and analysts for that to where, the game planning and the X's and O's is a lot more important. And even more so in the NIL era where, it's not as important that you have guys that are just massive grinders, and putting 20 hours into wooing some recruits. Like those days are kind of passing us by right now. I think the changes that are coming to the college system, making it a little bit more professionalized, is going to allow a little bit more free flowing between the college and NFL games at the coaching level. And I think Matt Rhule is going to be a good example of that. I understand the reticence of saying, there's no sure thing, and Matt Rhule at any of these places is no sure thing. But I think in terms of his ultimate track record, what he's able to do in terms of building those programs, fitting multiple cultures. He was like I said, Northeast guy going down to Texas. That's a very different thing. And he adjusted,
and not just anywhere in Texas. He went to Baylor, and not just Baylor, but like Baylor when it had been nuked.
Yeah.
So that totally fair.
And so you got also a very different institution, Baylor. Not only in terms of dealing with everything off the field, but because of the religious nature of that university and how important that is to that athletic department. I think adjusting to that culture as well was a big thing that Matt Rhule did. So being able to go to different places, I think is a key trait. That adaptability as a head coach, and Matt Rhule can do that. Did it work out in the NFL? No, it hasn't. But you know what? That's the case for a lot of these guys. I mean, Steve Spurrier went to the NFL and came back and resurrected South Carolina. You've seen what's happening with Chip Kelly. You're wearing the UCLA home field apparel shirt there. I mean, Chip's got UCLA in the top 12. Going to go see him next week when he returns to Oregon in what should be one of the games of the year in the Pac-12. Got DTR. It was a slow rebuild there, but they've eventually got things going. So I think just in general, if you're looking at him objectively as a head coaching candidate, Matt Rhule is one of the top guys available. On top of the fact of the matter is that there's no like one true, here's that hot assistant, here's that hot group of 5 program. I think that the pool this year, is a bit limited in that regards. I think, there's Jamie Caldwell at Coastal Carolina. His name's come up a bunch. Maybe he's that guy, especially with App State undefeated right now. But there's just not the Tom Herman types that we were thinking. All right, well that's going to be a home run. There really is not that in terms of this coaching carousel right now. So I think that puts even more emphasis on Matt Rhule kind of being the guy for a lot of these Power 5 programs that are looking to make a splash.
Yeah, I think because of what you just described, and maybe this is just me superimposing my own values over something that just isn't there, is I would think, well, if there's not somebody who we absolutely have to hire based on their overwhelming credentials or their overwhelming tie to this place, that this is a chance then to open up the search and consider a coordinator that we might not have before, consider somebody who might not necessarily fit the same profile, to look at somebody like a Sam Pittman, or, heaven forbid, a minority candidate, right? Or somebody that's not the same 3 people that everybody comes in and interviews every single time, especially if now there's more evidence to suggest that the home run hire doesn't exist. Well, this is now an opportunity to even sell that to your more persnickety constituents, that why it's important to have a wider reach. That might be your competitive advantage. I can also understand, while that might be my hope, a retread who has multiple fan bases and schools that will vouch for him and said that he did well, and a guy that is, has that NFL experience, I get why that would be even more important. That would be not what I would prefer people to do necessarily, but I get how the game goes.
Yeah, and well, I think it's just going to be an interesting coaching carousel in general. We have not yet opened up at Auburn. That might come around the corner, but the domino effects that are going to end up happening because of not only Matt Rhule kind of getting into the game if he wants to, but poaching other guys at other places. I know I've talked with a few coaches. They think it could be a little bit active in terms of some job jumping from a few guys. So I think that is something to keep an eye out. And you look at some of the schools that might end up making a change. I think just the patience, for both the NFL and college football is as short as ever nowadays. And so there's always a curveball. I think we kind of got that with Wisconsin, but that's not really a case of it coming fully open. So we could get a few more things that might pique the interest of candidates like Matt Rhule. And I think it's going to be really fascinating to kind of follow these next couple of years. And the other thing with Matt Rhule that you got to keep in mind is he's available now. That is another thing that we've kind of seen this trend of, hey, we can interview somebody, we can hire them early, they can evaluate the roster, they can go into the portal knowing what they need, they can go into recruiting knowing what they need with that early signing period. You kind of make a dent on the recruiting trail. So the ability to flip rosters nowadays is more paramount than ever. And we're seeing success at a lot of places who have been able to do that, like USC and Lincoln Riley, what they've been able to do. So I just look at Matt Rhule, and I think for a lot of candidates, maybe he's not the perfect fit, but in terms of checking off boxes, I think probably more so than anybody out there right now, he's a guy that does that.
You did hit on something that is pretty important to kind of put a bow on all this. Is you can't be as patient as you might have been before with the ability to turn over rosters pretty quickly. And I mean, you kind of saw Kyle Whittingham, you'll talk about this a little bit with the Salt Lake Tribune, I think earlier this week, when you're pointing to USC as this example of a program that did it really well. And maybe they did that with a lot of NIL money. Maybe they did that with a lot of other things, but you turn over 20% of your roster and went from non-competitive to now a real college football playoff team, right? Candidacy, right? Texas went from huge turnover on their roster, went from not making a bowl game to now should win probably at least 9 games and go into the season here with expectations. Now, granted, I might say, but for every USC and for Texas, there's a Miami. Or there are other programs that have tried to do this and have not been as successful. But the idea of being able to get a year to establish your culture and maybe not have to demonstrate a real proof of concept until the end of that second year as you kind of build forward there, I don't think you're going to be able to get that at Florida or Florida Atlantic. Like you don't necessarily have to come in and win 10 games that first year, but you have to be able to demonstrate what your program is supposed to look like. And everyone's going to have to portal up a little bit. And, I don't know to what extent the industry will correct itself within a year or two about this, because there's some real questions about how sustainable that approach to roster management really is. I think I might hold up Michigan State this year as a potential cautionary example of doing really well with a couple of portal guys in one cycle, and then maybe having that mask some problems with your roster that weren't properly addressed. And if a couple of those guys don't pan out, suddenly you're atrocious. Which is a thing that happens in basketball all of the time too. But this is coming from somebody in the cheap seats who did not give him $1 million to hire a football coach. And I also don't have $1 million riding on a coach being successful or not. That kind of impatience, I don't think typically leads to good results. It doesn't in most other industries, but nothing about this stupid business makes sense. Which is a good segue to potentially talking about Auburn next week, I think.
Yeah, and I'm going to be very curious too. We've seen, especially with Lance Leipold, another guy who's been able to change the roster over very quickly and find success in year two. How much the smaller school, whether FCS types or below, are going to get looks now at the FBS level. I think, especially when you look at some of the openings that could come up at the Group of Five level. Obviously, there's always the case of MAC coaches potentially moving on to bigger jobs. You look at places like in the Mountain West as well. There's some good candidates out in big sky country in particular, with some of those teams that have put together some good programs. I think it's going to be very interesting to see, not only at the top of the end of the food chain with guys like Matt Rhule, but kind of also in that middle tier, lower tier, what direction ADs do tend to go, because I think more than ever in the college game, you're starting to see that separation between talent acquisition and X's and O's on Saturdays is becoming more important than ever. You're going to have somebody responsible for one, and the other pressure on game days is a whole different deal. And I think the coaches that can manage both of those, with ease, are going to find the most success as we kind of move forward in this area. You mentioned Kyle Whittingham there in his comments. It's interesting too, because he brought those up kind of unprovoked, I guess, at his Monday news conference. And the thing that I found funny is as much as he wants to mention NIL when it comes to USC flipping that roster, not to say that it has not been the case where those guys have not gotten NIL deals, but in terms of like the collectives and stuff like that, USC very unorganized compared to some of the other places like Nebraska, like in the SEC. I just saw the other day in terms of Ole Miss and how they're getting on the same page with all their boosters and their collectives and being a little bit more organized with things. Not necessarily the case there at USC, but no. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the schools are reacting, and kind of adjusting to things on the fly, because some coaches might come in with an entirely different setup and want changes being made to how those relationships are with collectives, how the boosters are contributing to the program. So coaches like Matt Rhule, they've not only got a bit of a blank slate in terms of some of these programs, but they're going to have to make some adjustments as well.
That, I think, is a conversation for a different episode, because I could do 45 minutes just on what Whittingham just said and what you were just talking about, because I believe that there is a recruiting industrial complex narrative that's being set right now about the particular importance of specific collectives, or about this particular importance of certain kinds of bagman NIL and recruiting. And I don't think the data, to the extent that data exists right now, bears that out exactly, to the point where the results have not been as transformational. That's a different conversation, though, about USC and Ole Miss and Ohio State and Texas A&M and all these other things. And
it's a conversation that we've been having for 2 decades now about, oh, well, you heard this rumor about this guy paying a player. Well, now instead of this rumor about so-and-so paying so-and-so, you can just throw in, this collective is doing this NIL, this and that. And there's been very little verification for a lot of it. So it's the same old rumors. It's just resaid in a different manner.
Yeah, that's maybe that's the lead in for the other show. But this show is about wrapped up. You can go find Brian's other work here on Collegiate Sports Connect, in particular his most recent episode of HeadCoachU, bringing in another special musical guest to talk about what I think is I haven't heard the whole episode yet, but you talked to Dave Clawson, right?
I did a fantastic conversation with Dave. I think, one of the more thoughtful coaches. I mean, he's been around for several decades now at a number of different places. So he has that perspective of coaching at places like Richmond and Fordham. And it was interesting to see how he's adjusted his philosophy as a head coach over 9 seasons now at Wake Forest. And so he's got the Demon Deacs, the smallest, Power 5 program by enrollment, and how he's using that to his advantage. We talked about that. Him and Bronco go way back. It was interesting to kind of get their viewpoint in terms of what their discussions were, not only as competitors going back to that 2020 pandemic season, but how they kind of used each other to get through some of the tough tasks. And there's some interesting stories on that. So we got some more guests lined up, some other head coaches coming up. So be sure wherever you're listening to this here podcast, you're also subscribed to HeadCoachU. Got a bunch of other things on Fox Sports this week. Speaking of Chip Kelly, wrote about him and some of the others like Brett Bielema, who are kind of thriving now now and some second acts in college football. It's a lot more coming on that front. So a lot going on. It is a busy time on the sports calendar and a busy time for me, especially coming Thursday through about Tuesday or Wednesday. It's kind of crazy, but always fun as well, especially joining you here on Going for Two.
The reason I'm most excited to listen to this conversation, beyond the fact that I happen to know that Clawson's a particularly thoughtful guy, most of the people in Broncos kind of universe are more cerebral coaches. I want to hear him explain the weird handoff that Wake's offense does, where it looks like I've heard this compared to the dad walking the bride down the aisle, very slow and deliberative, and they're both kind of holding the football and it breaks off at the last minute, and you think there's no way in hell this dumb thing should work, and then they gain 8 yards.
Well, I talked a little bit with Dave beforehand. They are kind of secretive there at Wake in terms of actually like some of the machinations and how how it actually works.
Yeah, I can't imagine why.
You can ask the Stanford coaches. The Stanford coaches were kind of inquired before the year, hey, can we come and learn how to do the slow mesh? And they kind of got a polite rebuke, I guess you could say, from the Wake Forest staff. But it was interesting to just kind of hear how it came about and why they use it, and from Broncos' perspective too. Just kind of defending it. We had a little interesting discussion in terms of how difficult it is to defend that versus say the triple option, because Wake just came off a big win at Army, and Dave kind of mentioned it as well. Last year they both scored over 60 points, one of the wildest games in all of college football last year. And then talking about his defense making some changes coming into this year, and they get a big 45-10 win over the Black Knights. But fun times with Dave, and we got a lot more in store here on HeadCoachU.
I'm a sucker for this kind of stuff because I recognize I'm a scheme idiot. And I think one of the signs of a really effective coach, this would be a good video series, I think, for the offseason in general. We kind of talked about this before at D1 Ticker, is to have people explain these kind of basic concepts as dumb as possible to somebody like me, because you have a very limited time to train and teach your athletes about some of these concepts. And if you're able to get it so I can understand it, you can definitely do it so your junior right tackle can understand it and then repeat it a gajillion times so you don't have to think about it anymore. Like this, like Nick Saban's really good at this too. Like every time someone shows one of those clips where he turns off the robot brain for a minute and actually like walks through a route tree and here's where my defensive back's supposed to be on this particular play. Love that. I'll watch every one of those videos. At Extra Points, we have beyond the reporting about Kennesaw State and Conference USA, on Wednesday morning, we will have a story about potentially expanding the college baseball postseason. You might have seen a story from our friend Matt Norlander at CBS last week that indicated one of the many proposals Transformation Committee is looking at would be a rule that would allow them to expand the postseason for any particular sport up to 25% of the participating schools, which would mean, hypothetically, a larger men's basketball tournament, which we've talked about a couple of different times on this show, is something that's being discussed and has been discussed, but could also mean larger almost any other tournament. I don't know very much about college baseball. I'm a Midwesterner. There's like 3 schools here that care about it, and the weather sucks. So I needed to have other people explain it to me. So I talked to some coaches, some conference commissioners, some athletic directors about whether there would be interest in doing this and what kind of questions need to be solved. And we may do this again for some other sports, because over the course of those conversations, you also heard some things like, well, here's what soccer does that's a little bit different, or here's what makes sense for volleyball, but we wouldn't make as much sense here for lacrosse. We'll have all of that on Extra Points as well, along with, I think, some other interesting stories. You can find all of those at extrapointsmv.com. And we will see you again on the internet very soon with some other exciting stories here throughout the D1 Ticker universe of publications. Enjoy the week, everybody.